The Assyrians were not the kind to easily allow a hard-won province to slip from their grasp. After mounting 2 campaigns to secure control over Egypt, Ashurbanipal must have been frustrated by the rising power of the Sate dynasty. Yet Psamtik first managed to break free from Assyrian rule without provoking much of a reaction from Nineveh. This lack of response stemmed from a more pressing concern closer to home. In southern Mesopotamia, right under the Assyrian gaze, Babylonia was once again gaining strength. Within months of Ashurbanipal's death, a dynamic new ruler ascended the Babylonian throne and began reclaiming territories lost to Assyria 2 generations prior. Swallowing its pride, Assyria chose to ally with its former vassal, Sate Egypt, to counter this emerging threat. At first, the alliance proved remarkably effective. Psamtik first supported Assyria in its Near Eastern campaigns, pushing back Babylonian advances as far as Carchemish on the Euphrates River, the first time an Egyptian army had ventured that far since Ramesses II. For a moment, Babylonia's progress seemed to halt. However, history was turning against the overstretched Assyrian Empire. Despite Egyptian support, Assyria suffered a crushing defeat in 609 and was fully annexed by Babylonia the following year. Now fighting to defend its interests, Egypt returned to Carchemish in 605 and launched a bold offensive against the Babylonian forces. The effort failed disastrously, with the Egyptian army decisively defeated. Egypt lost its final holdings in the region, and one by one, its allies fell to Babylon's power. Tyre was the first to fall, followed by Jerusalem. The pharaoh's partners were swept away by the unstoppable momentum of the Babylonian war machine. By 586, even with multiple courageous uprisings, the independent states of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine had been erased from existence. Judah was conquered, and its population exiled to Babylon, where they lamented their displacement. At this point, Egypt stood as the last barrier. Psamtik's second successor, Wahibra, reigned 589 to 570, successfully repelled a Babylonian invasion attempt in 582, but he was fully aware that alliances were essential to preserve Egypt's sovereignty. Following in his father's footsteps, he turned to the Greek world and placed Ionian and Carian mercenaries in prominent positions within the Egyptian military. These foreign troops had served honorably under Psamtik I and II and were expected to do so again in defense of Egypt's independence. Although this decision was necessary, it stirred deep resentment among the native Egyptian soldiers, who felt increasingly sidelined by the high-ranking foreigners in their ranks. The breaking point came in January 570, when a failed military expedition in Libya triggered a widespread mutiny among the surviving Egyptian troops. Wahibra dispatched one of his most seasoned generals, Ahmose, to quell the rebellion. Instead of restoring order, Ahmose took command of the revolt and was declared king by the insurrectionists. Turning his forces back toward Egypt, he marched on the royal city of Sais, captured it, and forced Wahibra to take refuge in his heavily fortified palace in Memphis. By August, Ahmose had been acknowledged as pharaoh across the western Nile Delta. In October, after a tense standoff during the summer heat, Wahibra attempted to retake his throne by attacking Sais. Ahmose's forces met the loyalists in battle and crushed them completely. Wahibra managed to escape and fled abroad to the court of Babylon. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadrezzar, saw this as a golden opportunity. Hosting the ousted pharaoh presented a perfect chance to interfere in Egypt's internal affairs and possibly install a Babylonian puppet on the throne of Horus. Recognizing the imminent threat, Ahmose II swiftly took action to prepare for a possible invasion. He forged an alliance with the Greeks of Cyrene, a coastal settlement in Libya established by colonists in the 7th century. At the same time, he dismissed a Greek garrison stationed in the eastern Nile Delta, suspecting its loyalty to the deposed Wahibra. In this context, practicality outweighed ideology. In 567, a Babylonian expedition, led by Wahibra, attempted to penetrate Egypt by both land and sea, but the invading force was decisively crushed. This time, Wahibra did not escape his fate. He was captured and executed. Despite the disgrace that marked his final years, Ahmose ensured that he was laid to rest with full royal honors. Aware of the power of public perception, the victorious king maintained a reputation as a man of the people, often appearing in satirical tales as a relatable and down-to-earth figure, yet presented himself in public as a devout and rightful sovereign. Those in the military who had supported Ahmose II's rise to the throne in hopes of reversing Egypt's pro-Greek orientation were soon disappointed. As part of his firm opposition to Babylon, Ahmose deepened Egypt's ties with the Greek world. Since recovering from the turmoil of the Sea Peoples, Greece had been repopulated during the 9th century and was now a patchwork of independent city-states, expanding their influence through colonies along the Mediterranean and Black Sea shores. These cities, which relied heavily on open commerce, viewed Babylon's territorial ambitions as a direct threat to their economic interests. Beyond diplomatic alignment, Egypt had strategic reasons for strengthening bonds with the Greeks. Aegean mercenaries were highly sought after across the Near East for their reputation in combat. The pharaoh extended lavish offerings to Greek religious sites, most notably contributing generously to the restoration of Delphi after it was devastated by fire, and even took a Greek princess as his wife. But his most significant move focused on Greek merchants operating within Egypt. Since the era of Psamtik I, settlers from Ionia had established themselves in the Delta. Many who once served as mercenaries had turned to trade, accumulating wealth through a flourishing import-export network that brought in goods like olive oil, wine, and especially silver from Greece in exchange for Egyptian grain. The scale and profitability of this trade were too great for the Egyptian state to ignore. Ahmose II sought to harness this economic activity by introducing a regulation disguised as a privilege. He designated Naucratis, located just 10 miles from his capital at Sais, as the exclusive trading center for Greek merchants. This allowed him to oversee and benefit from foreign trade under the appearance of supporting free commerce, reinforcing both his political image and economic control. Thanks to royal support and official protection, Naucratis quickly rose to become Egypt's most active port. It soon evolved into a remarkably diverse and cosmopolitan city, where Cypriots and Phoenicians mingled freely with Greeks from Miletus, Samos, and Chios. Several Greek communities established their own places of worship. The Chians dedicated theirs to Aphrodite, while the Samians honored Hera. Additionally, a shared sanctuary known as the Hellenion was created, allowing Greeks of various origins to gather and offer devotion to the collective pantheon of their homeland. Yet, beyond its religious devotion, the city had a more hedonistic side. Naucratis became famous across the Greek world for the beauty and permissiveness of its women. According to Herodotus, it was a fine place to find lovely courtesans. One infamous prostitute even gained her freedom through the generosity of Sappho's brother, though his motives may not have been entirely selfless. By the mid-6th century, Egypt, under the clever and strategic leadership of Ahmose, was undergoing a period of renewal. The country enjoyed domestic prosperity and stability, while earning respect and recognition on the international stage. Egypt had successfully resisted first the Assyrian and then the Babylonian empires, and had secured its status as a significant force in the complex landscape of global diplomacy. The nation itself had transformed, becoming more ethnically diverse and culturally varied than ever before. Yet Egypt had long served as a crossroads of civilizations and a haven for newcomers, and it had always managed to integrate them into its fabric. Time and again, pharaonic culture emerged stronger and more resilient. It was believed that the gods had destined Egypt to endure and prevail, and many Egyptians clung to that conviction with unwavering faith. The rulers of Sais, a city in Egypt's western delta, were among the most resilient figures in ancient Egyptian history. Over the course of 200 years, they maneuvered through alliances and power struggles to assert dominance, not only in Lower Egypt, their home territory, but across the entire Nile Valley. Their rise began in 728 BCE with Tefnakht, the Prince of the West, whose defiance against a rival Nubian dynasty set the tone for the state's independence. For 70 years, they resisted Kushite influence, refusing to submit. Later, they shrewdly leveraged Assyrian protection to expand their influence in the Delta. Eventually, they broke free from their status as vassals and seized control of a unified Egypt. Once in power, the Sate dynasty proved just as adept, aligning with the Assyrians to hold back the common threat from Babylonia. They honored native Egyptian deities while securing the loyalty of Greek mercenaries. Through these strategies, the Psamtik dynasty preserved Egypt's sovereignty in an increasingly unpredictable world. Yet even the Sates had their limits. Within 10 years of fending off a Babylonian invasion, a far more determined and unstoppable enemy emerged, seemingly from nowhere. In 559 BCE, a young and ambitious leader named Kirash, better known as Cyrus, ascended the throne of Persia, then merely a subordinate state under the powerful Medes. Unwilling to remain under their control, Cyrus rebelled, overthrew the Median ruler, and took the empire for himself. At the time, the Egyptian pharaoh paid little attention. The conflict appeared distant and irrelevant, a foreign struggle in a remote land between unknown peoples. But Egypt's indifference would soon prove costly. In less than 20 years, Cyrus had conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, followed by Babylonia, establishing himself as the supreme ruler of an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the peaks of the Hindu Kush. Seemingly overnight, a new and terrifying superpower had emerged, hungry for further conquest. Faced with this growing threat, all Ahmose II could do was continue recruiting Greek mercenaries, strengthen his navy, and brace for what might come. When Cyrus died in 530 BCE during a campaign against the fierce Scythian nomads of Central Asia, it offered a brief flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly extinguished by events within Egypt itself. Ahmose II, a seasoned military leader, had successfully defended Egypt for 40 years. His death in 526 marked a turning point. His successor, Psamtik III, was young, inexperienced, and untested. The passing of a monarch had always been a precarious time, but with a hostile force looming nearby, it became a critical vulnerability. Cambyses, Cyrus's successor and the new king of Persia, recognized the opportunity and acted swiftly. Within weeks of hearing of Ahmose's death, he launched a campaign toward the Nile Delta. In 525 BCE, Persian troops invaded Egypt, captured Memphis, executed Psamtik III, and absorbed the two lands into the expanding Persian Empire. Cambyses wasted no time in establishing Persian-style governance over his newly conquered territory. One of his first acts was to abolish the office of the god's wife of Ammonius, denying Ahmose's daughter her rightful succession and removing the long-serving Ankh-Nesneferibra from the role, a position she had held for an extraordinary 60 years. From that point forward, no such religious office would exist to act as a symbol of native pride in Upper Egypt. However, not all Egyptians viewed the Persian conquest as a catastrophe. Some officials adapted swiftly and willingly to the new regime. Among them was Cunning, the overseer of works. Descended from a prestigious family of architects that traced its lineage back to the reign of Ramesses II, Cunning bore a name honoring Ahmose II, just like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He had served the Sate king faithfully in the quarries of Wadi Hammamat. But despite his overt loyalty to the former dynasty, Cunning showed no hesitation in accepting the rule of Persia. Not only did he survive the regime change, he thrived under it. His loyalty was rewarded with several high-paying priestly positions. For individuals like Cunning, self-interest and career advancement outweighed patriotic sentiment. Others, though perhaps more idealistic, saw cooperation with the Persians as a way to preserve Egyptian identity. For the elite class, religion remained the heart of their values and cultural heritage. Demonstrating devotion to local deities and supporting temple life were essential to gaining respect in their communities. Faced with foreign conquerors who honored unfamiliar gods, Some Egyptians chose not to resist, but instead to influence their new rulers, to teach them the Egyptian way of life. One man from Sais, Egypt's proudest delta city, succeeded in doing exactly that. His name was Wejahorosnet, and he was perfectly suited for the task. His father had been a priest at the local temple, and Wejahorosnet himself was deeply devoted to the goddess Neith. Like many saints before him, he had entered military service and risen to the rank of admiral under Ahmose II. He had likely fought naval battles against the invading Persian forces. Wejahorosnet later referred to the conquest as a great disaster unlike anything the land had ever seen. Yet within months of Cambyses' victory, Wejahorosnet had ingratiated himself with the Persian king, rising to the rank of senior courtier and earning the prestigious role of chief physician, granting him close access to the royal court. In public, he embraced the new regime completely, and with no sign of hesitation, praised the Persian conquest in glowing terms, declaring Cambyses to be the great ruler not only of Egypt but of all foreign lands. But Wejahorosnet's actions went beyond mere cooperation. With his deep knowledge of Egyptian traditions, he was uniquely positioned to influence the Persians and begin their gradual transformation into culturally legitimate rulers. A crucial part of this process was his authorship of Cambyses' royal titulary, an official Egyptian-style royal name. Through such initiatives, Wejahorosnet guided the Persians through a slow but deliberate process of Egyptianization, just as previous foreign dynasties, the Hyksos, Libyans, and Kushites, had undergone before them. Cambyses appeared to accept and support the process of cultural adaptation. Ruling over a vast and multilingual empire, he had little choice but to adopt an inclusive approach. Rather than imposing a rigid cultural agenda, he demonstrated a notable degree of tolerance toward the various customs and beliefs of the peoples under his rule. His predecessor, Cyrus, had freed the Jews from their Babylonian exile, and Cambyses continued in that spirit, extending protection to the substantial Jewish population living on the island of Abu in Egypt. Elsewhere in the Nile Valley, he willingly retained Egyptian officials in administrative roles, and for much of the population, especially those in the countryside, daily life remained largely unchanged. The only significant restructuring occurred within the military, where native Egyptian officers were replaced and their talents redirected, as was the case with Wejahorosnet. After losing his naval command, the former admiral focused his efforts on preserving and revitalizing his local temple. Leveraging his influential position at court, he worked to promote the cult of Neith in Sais. He first complained to Cambyses about the presence of foreigners who had violated the sanctity of the temple by taking residence within its sacred grounds. Wejahorosnet convinced the king to have them removed. Following continued advocacy, Cambyses agreed to purify the temple and restore its priests and offerings to the state they had enjoyed before the Persian conquest. As Wejahorosnet later explained, these actions were taken because he had helped the king understand the importance of Sais. To confirm his respect for local tradition, Cambyses personally visited the temple and bowed before the statue of Neith, performing the ritual gesture as every king does. Through such acts, the Persian ruler began to take on the identity of a true pharaoh in the eyes of his new subjects. Similar developments occurred throughout Egypt. In the delta city of Tarimu, the influential Nesmehis, who held the role of overseer of the royal harem, used his court position to benefit his community and its religious practices. It likely helped that the Persian monarchs felt a connection to the power of the local lion god Mahes. Still, it was the initiative and persistence of Egyptian officials in guiding and shaping their new rulers that played a critical role in shaping the First Persian period. In Memphis, the sacred Apis bull cult continued uninterrupted, and the priest in charge even claimed credit for influencing the conquerors. "I placed fear of you, Apis, in the hearts of all people and foreigners who were in Egypt." Although Egypt had lost its sovereignty, its people remained steadfast in preserving the cultural and religious traditions they held dear. In truth, the Persian conquest of Egypt was far from the great disaster some portrayed it to be. On the contrary, The new rulers injected much-needed energy and innovation into the administration of the Nile Valley, revitalizing its institutions and infrastructure. This period of renewal reached its peak during the reign of Darius I, Cambyses' successor. Darius took a special interest in Egypt's centers of learning, the houses of life attached to prominent temples. From his royal court in Susa, constructed by Egyptian artisans using exotic materials like Nubian ebony and ivory, he instructed Wejahorosnet, by then an aged and trusted court official, to return to Sais and restore its house of life, which had fallen into neglect. Possibly relying on temple records, Darius is credited with codifying Egypt's laws to provide a stable foundation for governance. He recognized Egypt not as a typical province, but as a land of exceptional wealth and cultural heritage. It held a unique status in his empire and was simply too valuable to mismanage or lose. As a result, the satrap station in Memphis had no authority over financial matters. Instead, economic affairs were overseen by a separate official, a chancellor, whose duties also included monitoring the satrap to ensure he did not become too assimilated. In fact, satraps were often summoned back to Persia to personally report on their conduct to the king. Generally, Darius governed Egypt with a light hand. Native Egyptians continued to serve in high positions. The tribute demanded was not excessive, and evidence from the period points to widespread prosperity, including in rural areas. Persian control was maintained through strong communication lines with the broader empire, a sophisticated intelligence network, and a ring of strategically placed garrisons. Fortified outposts stretched from Dorjanardi in Lower Nubia to the Sinai Desert, providing the means to suppress uprisings swiftly and effectively. In terms of economic development, Darius prioritized enhancing maritime trade between Egypt and the Persian Gulf. In Upper Egypt, the overland route through the Wadi Hammamat to the Red Sea coast was reopened and actively used by Persian expeditions. But in Lower Egypt, where no such direct path existed, a new solution was needed, one that led to one of ancient Egypt's most ambitious engineering feats, rivaling even the grandeur of the Giza pyramids. During the earlier Sate period, Pharaoh Nekau II had begun plans for a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. A century later, the Persians brought this vision to completion. Where the Sates had merely conceived the idea, the Persians made a reality. The result was a canal approximately 150 feet wide, stretching about 40 miles from the Nile's easternmost branch through the Wadi Tumilat, reaching the Bitter Lakes and continuing south to the Gulf of Suez. As ships made the 4-day journey along the canal, they passed by towering stelae of pink granite, strategically placed at key points along the route. Each monumental slab, standing 10 feet tall and 7 feet wide, was engraved with carefully chosen scenes and inscriptions that underscored Darius's authority over his vast empire. One side portrayed the king protected by his Persian deity, Ahura Mazda, accompanied by a cuneiform inscription. The other side featured the Egyptian symbol of unity, a winged sun disk, along with a hieroglyphic inscription praising the ruler. In traditional pharaonic style, the Egyptian side also included a frieze of 24 kneeling figures, each shown atop an oval ring inscribed with the name of a province in the empire. This type of imagery would have been instantly recognizable to any Egyptian familiar with the great temple reliefs, though with one striking detail. On Darius's stele, Egypt itself was counted among the subject lands, being listed alongside legendary regions like Persia, Media, Babylonia, Assyria, and even India was of little consolation. On the reverse of the monument, Darius made his claim clear: I, a Persian, along with Persians, conquered Egypt. I commanded the digging of a canal from the river in Egypt, the Nile by name, to the Bitter River, referring to the Red Sea. In 497 BCE, to mark the canal's official opening, the king attended in person, proudly observing as a fleet of 24 ships carrying Egyptian tribute slowly sailed eastward toward Persia. While the creation of the ancient Suez Canal stemmed from a drive to enhance maritime trade, Persian interest in controlling the trans-Saharan trade routes on Egypt's western flank led to another impressive engineering achievement. Karga, the southernmost of Egypt's four major oases, had long been a crucial hub in desert travel. A web of paths intersected there, connecting the Nile Valley to Nubia in the south and the territories beyond the Sahara to the west. Since the late Old Kingdom, Karga had not supported permanent settlement, as the increasingly arid climate and lack of rainfall had made habitation nearly impossible. True to their resourceful nature, the Persians introduced two transformative solutions. First, they brought camels into Egypt from their Bactrian and Arabian provinces. These animals revolutionized desert transport, allowing caravans to journey far longer without needing frequent water sources. Second, the Persians developed a remarkable method for extracting water from the sandstone aquifers deep beneath the surface. They carved extensive underground rock-cut galleries throughout Karga, functioning as hidden aqueducts that delivered fresh artesian water to irrigate fields and gardens above ground. This technological breakthrough turned vast stretches of arid land into productive farmland, capable of yielding cereals, fruits, vegetables, and cotton, a crop introduced by the Persians. Around these subterranean water systems, new villages and towns began to emerge, complete with temples and administrative buildings. Due to their remote location far from the Nile, papyrus was rare and expensive, so residents wrote on pottery shards instead. This practice has left behind an exceptional archive that offers a vivid glimpse into everyday life in this distant corner of the Persian Empire. As expected, both individuals and institutions safeguarded their most important documents. In addition to personal notes, household accounts, and routine records, legal contracts appear frequently. These records reveal that water, not land, was the true foundation of wealth in Karga. Rights to the water flowing from each aqueduct were meticulously divided into days and fractions of days, which could be bought, sold, leased, or used to secure loans. In this desert economy, water was, in every sense, currency. Coinage was present as well. By 410 BCE, Athenian silver staters had become the standard form of money, reflecting the deepening influence of the Greek world on Egypt's economy. It was just one more sign of how culturally diverse Persian Egypt had become, a place where interfaith and intercultural marriages were common, where temple reliefs showed fantastical winged figures from Zoroastrian beliefs, and where children of Persian immigrants often adopted Egyptian names. In short, under the reign of Darius I, Egypt became a thriving crossroads of peoples and traditions, a land marked by cultural exchange, commercial vitality, and a spirit of tolerance. But this flourishing chapter would not last forever. Darius's successors displayed significantly less interest in their Egyptian province. They no longer even pretended to uphold the customs of Egyptian kingship or engage with its religious traditions. Economic activity began to wane, and political authority weakened as the Persian leadership turned its focus increasingly toward their volatile western territories and the ongoing conflicts involving Athens and Sparta. Within this context of administrative neglect and commercial decline, relations between Egyptians and their foreign rulers began to deteriorate. Just a year before Darius I passed away, the first rebellion erupted in the Delta. It would take a successor, Xerxes I, 2 years to restore order. In an attempt to prevent further uprisings, Xerxes removed Egyptians from positions of influence. But such actions did little to halt the growing instability. While Xerxes and his generals concentrated on their battles with the Greeks, most notably at Thermopylae and Salamis, ambitious provincial families throughout Lower Egypt began to dream of reclaiming power. Some even went so far as to adopt royal titles. After barely 50 years, Persian dominance in Egypt was beginning to fray. The assassination of Xerxes I in the summer of 465 BCE provided both the opportunity and the catalyst for a second major revolt. This time, the rebellion was led by Iretharu, a compelling figure from Sais, continuing his family's legacy of resistance. Unlike the earlier revolt, this one proved much harder to suppress. Within a year, Ahmose had won support throughout the Delta and beyond. Even government scribes in Kurga Oasis dated official contracts by referencing Year 2 of Ahmose, Prince of the Rebels. Only in Egypt's far southeast, such as in the Wadi Hammamat quarries, did local officials remain loyal to Persian authority. Recognizing the widespread support for his cause, Ahmose reached out to the Persians' archrival, Athens, seeking military assistance. Still resentful over the destruction of their sacred temples by Xerxes' forces decades earlier, the Athenians were eager to intervene. They sent a war fleet to Egypt, and the combined Egyptian and Greek forces managed to push the Persian army back to their stronghold in Memphis, effectively besieging them there for months. But the Persians were determined not to lose one of their most valuable provinces. Eventually, through sheer numbers and relentless pressure, they managed to break out of Memphis and slowly reconquer the country, region by region. After nearly 10 years of resistance, Ahmose was finally captured and executed by crucifixion, serving as a stark warning to future rebels. Despite the brutal suppression, the Egyptian appetite for freedom had been reignited. Not long after, another rebellion flared up, once again led by figures from Sais and again with Athenian backing. Only the peace treaty of 449 BCE between Persia and Athens temporarily ended Greek involvement in Egypt's internal conflicts, restoring trade and travel between the two Mediterranean powers. Yet the unrest within Egypt did not simply disappear. The country remained simmering with dissatisfaction, and the possibility of another full-scale uprising loomed large. In 410 BCE, civil unrest erupted across Egypt, plunging parts of the country into near anarchy and sparking violent clashes, especially in the deep south. On the island of Abu, the Egyptian priests of Cunning incited a mob to attack the neighboring Jewish temple dedicated to Yahweh. Although the attackers were later apprehended and imprisoned, the incident underscored the growing turmoil and instability within Egyptian society. In the Delta region, a new wave of local leaders emerged, determined to reclaim independence. Among them was Amidst of Sais, grandson of the rebel leader from 4 decades earlier. Bearing both his grandfather's name and that of the founder of the Sate dynasty, he was resolute in his mission to revive his family's legacy. Employing guerrilla tactics and using his intimate knowledge of the Delta's terrain, he launched a persistent campaign against the Persian authorities. For 6 years, this resistance movement wore down the occupying forces, proving that even a global empire could struggle to suppress a grassroots rebellion supported by the local populace. The critical turning point came in 404 BCE. Just as Cambyses had exploited the death of Egypt's pharaoh to conquer the land in 525 BCE, the Egyptians seized a similar opportunity. Upon hearing of the death of Darius II, Amidst declared himself king. Though symbolic at first, the declaration rallied widespread support. By the end of 402 BCE, his kingship was acknowledged from the Mediterranean coast to the first cataract of the Nile. While some provincial officials continued to record dates using the regnal years of Artaxerxes II, likely to hedge their loyalties, the Persian Empire faced its own distractions. A planned invasion force, gathered in Phoenicia to retake Egypt, was instead redirected to address a revolt in Cyprus. With the threat of a Persian assault temporarily lifted, one might have expected Amidst to welcome the Cypriot admiral who fled to Egypt. However, in a typical display of Sate political maneuvering, he ordered the admiral's assassination, betraying rather than aiding a fellow rebel. Despite his cunning, Amidst's reign was short-lived. His rise to power, achieved through manipulation and violence, diminished the aura of divine legitimacy traditionally surrounding the pharaoh's role. Instead, the throne was exposed for what it truly had become, the ultimate political prize. Other powerful families in the Delta took notice. In October 399 BCE, a rival leader from the city of Jeddah launched his own coup, overthrowing Amidst and establishing a new ruling line. To signify the birth of this fresh dynasty, Nefertiti of Jeddah deliberately adopted the Horus name once held by Psamtik I, who had famously liberated Egypt from foreign domination. Yet the similarities ended there. Always mindful of a potential Persian retaliation, Nefertiti's reign, spanning from 399 to 393 BC, was defined by a frenzy of defensive preparations. His key diplomatic move was to forge an alliance with Sparta, sending supplies of grain and timber to support King Agesilaos in his campaign against the Persian Empire. In 393 BCE, when Nefertiti's son Hagar ascended the throne, it marked the first time in 5 generations that a native-born Egyptian had inherited kingship from his father. Despite bearing a name that meant the Arab, Hagar identified strongly with his Egyptian heritage and was determined to uphold the traditional duties of a pharaoh. Early in his reign, he favored the title, "He who satisfies the gods," reflecting his commitment to religious devotion. But reverence alone was not enough to ensure political stability. After scarcely a year in power, Hagar became the latest victim of internal strife among Egypt's elite families. A rival seized both his throne and his dynasty's monuments, continuing the relentless cycle of political upheaval. Within another year, however, Hagar managed to reclaim the crown and declared his renewed appearance as king. Still, the proclamation rang hollow. The institution of the monarchy had reached a historic low, stripped of dignity, authority, and the aura it once held. Though Hagar held on for another 10 years, his ineffective son, the second Nefertiti, remained in power for only 16 weeks before a military commander from Jebnejer usurped the throne. This marked the third change of dynasty in the Delta in just 20 years. Yet Nakhtembef, who reigned from 380 to 362 BCE, proved to be cut from a different cloth than his predecessors. Having witnessed firsthand the devastation caused by rival warlords, including what he termed the disaster of the previous king, he understood the fragility of the throne more than most. As a military leader, he recognized that real power required a solid base of armed strength. With Egypt constantly under threat of Persian invasion, his top priority was to be a mighty king who guards Egypt, a copper wall that protects the land. Still, he understood that physical strength alone would not be enough. Egyptian kingship had always carried a symbolic weight, functioning as much through psychological influence as through military might. To reinforce his image, Nakhtembef referred to himself as the ruler who cuts out the hearts of traitors. Restoring the monarchy's prestige required projecting a strong and traditional image to the people. Alongside the usual political strategies, such as appointing close family members and loyal allies to key government positions, Nakhtembef launched the most ambitious temple construction program Egypt had seen in 8 centuries. He aimed to leave no doubt that he was a pharaoh in the old, revered style. One of his first royal acts was to allocate 1/10 of the revenues collected at Naucratis, from import duties and local taxes, to the Temple of Neith at Sais. This move served a dual purpose. It appeased his state rivals while enhancing his own image as a devout ruler. Other significant donations followed, including generous support for the Temple of Horus at Edfu. As the living embodiment of Horus on earth, Nakhtembef saw it as fitting that he should support his divine counterpart's main sanctuary. Nakhtembef's efforts weren't just about spiritual merit. He also understood that Egypt's temples controlled vast economic resources, including farmland, mining operations, craft production, and trade routes. Investing in the temples was a practical way to stimulate the economy. A thriving economy, in turn, meant more surplus wealth, resources that could be used to fund Egypt's defenses, particularly the recruitment of Greek mercenaries. In this way, bolstering both the priesthood and the military went hand in hand. Yet maintaining that balance was delicate. If the temples were pressed too hard for resources, resentment could grow, threatening the very stability Nakhtembef sought to protect. As a thoughtful observer of his nation's past, Nakhtembef sought to prevent a repeat of the dynastic conflicts that had plagued Egypt in recent decades. To ensure a smooth succession, he revived the ancient practice of co-regency, appointing his son Jeter as joint ruler. However, The biggest threat to Jeter's reign would not come from domestic rivals, but from his own reckless approach to governance, both at home and abroad. Unlike his cautious father, Jeter opened his reign with an ambitious and ill-conceived campaign to wrest control of Palestine and Phoenicia from Persian hands. Whether driven by dreams of restoring Egypt's imperial past or seeking to justify his family's continued rule, the decision was both bold and unwise. Though the Persian Empire was dealing with internal unrest in Asia Minor, it was unlikely to surrender such vital territories without a fight. Moreover, the massive resources required for such a military expedition placed unsustainable pressure on Egypt's still recovering economy. In desperate need of silver to fund the hiring of Greek mercenaries, Jeter turned to Egypt's temples as a source of wealth. Convinced that taxing religious institutions was the easiest way to fill the treasury, he imposed a series of deeply unpopular levies: a tax on buildings, a poll tax, commodity purchase taxes, increased shipping duties, and finally, the confiscation of temple assets. To make matters worse, the mercenaries funded by these harsh measures, a force of 1,000 Spartan hoplites and 30 military advisors, arrived under the command of none other than Agesilaos, a former ally of Egypt. At 84, he was not interested in a subordinate role and demanded full command of the military. Jeter was forced to sideline another trusted Greek commander, Chabrias of Athens, who had originally been brought in by Hagar during the 380s to manage Egypt's defense. Chabrias was reassigned to lead the navy, while Agesilaos took charge of the land forces. But placing three powerful and proud leaders at the top created tension and instability from the very beginning. With public resentment mounting over the new taxes, mistrust and discord overshadowed the military campaign. One of the most vivid records of this disastrous campaign comes from an eyewitness, a healer named Winifred from the Central Delta. Born near the royal city of Tjebnecher, Winifred was exactly the kind of loyal subject favored by Nakhnebef's regime. Trained in the local temple, he specialized in healing and magic, skills that eventually brought him to Jeter's attention. When the campaign against Persia was launched, Winifred was appointed to keep the official military journal, a role of great significance in a culture where words carried magical power. Yet almost immediately, trouble arose. As the army began its march into Asia, a letter reached the regent in Memphis accusing Winifred of treason. He was arrested, bound in copper shackles, and sent back to Egypt for interrogation. But Winifred, like many skilled officials of his era, knew how to navigate political danger. Through clever maneuvering, he not only escaped punishment but earned the regent's trust and favor. He was granted official protection and rewarded with generous gifts. Meanwhile, before a single battle had been fought, most of Jeter's army abandoned him in favor of a charismatic young officer, none other than his own nephew, Prince Nakhtherheb, the son of the Memphis regent. Agesilaos eagerly supported the prince's claim and escorted him back to Egypt in triumph. After defeating a rival claimant, Nakhtherheb was installed as pharaoh. For his support, Agesilaos received 230 silver talents, a sum large enough to fund 5,000 mercenaries for a year, before returning to Sparta. Jeter, humiliated and abandoned, had no choice but to flee into Persian territory, the very enemy he had sought to challenge. Winifred was quickly dispatched with a naval force to pursue the former king. Eventually, Jeter was found in Susa, where the Persians, having no desire to harbor him, handed him over. He was brought back to Egypt in chains, and Winifred was once again showered with honors. In a time of political upheaval, loyalty to the prevailing power was the surest path to reward. Egypt's ongoing power struggle with the vast Persian Empire during the 4th century not only shaped its domestic and international strategies, but also deeply influenced its national mindset. The constant threat of reconquest and the need to remain ever alert for invasion caused the country to turn inward, searching for stability and reassurance. In a world marked by shifting global dynamics and uncertainty, the Egyptians increasingly clung to the traditions and values that distinguished them from other cultures. Of all these traditions, Religion stood out as the most enduring and unique hallmark of pharaonic civilization. Though viewed with contempt by the Greeks and with curious detachment by the Persians, Egypt's multitude of animal deities represented the highest ideals of native belief. These gods symbolized timeless, unchanging forces that offered the promise of salvation amidst the unpredictability of everyday life. Animal cults had long been a part of Egyptian spiritual life. Animals were interred in ritual enclosures as early as the pre-dynastic period, and the Apis bull had been venerated at Memphis since the earliest days of the Egyptian state. However, it was during the brief period of regained independence from Persian domination that these cults truly flourished, reaching levels of popularity and ritual elaboration previously unseen. This surge gave rise to some of the most curious religious practices ever recorded in Egypt. By the mid-4th century BCE, animal cults had become widespread across the land. In Bast, sacred cats were revered. In Thebes, it was dogs and gazelles. At Unit, bulls. At Shedit, crocodiles. And in Jadet, even certain species of fish were worshipped. Each cult operated its own temple and was served by a dedicated priesthood. Because temple workers rotated in and out of service, a large segment of the population benefited from the wealth generated by these religious institutions, making it a truly nationwide phenomenon. One of the most significant centers of animal worship was Saqqara, the ancient necropolis for Egypt's nobility and kings. By the time of Nakhthar-Heb's reign, the underground tombs of Egypt's elite were accompanied by an entire zoo's worth of sacred creatures. Among the most venerated sites at Saqqara was the Serapeum, a sprawling complex of temples and workshops built above a vast underground burial chamber for the Apis bulls. Not far away stood another elaborate structure dedicated to the worship of the mother of Apis, a sacred cow believed to be the earthly embodiment of the goddess Isis. Upon death, each of these cows underwent a meticulous ritual. They were purified, embalmed, dressed in linen wrappings, and adorned with amulets before being laid to rest in specially carved underground vaults. Excavating these burial chambers from solid rock could take up to 2 years, and the massive stone sarcophagi created for each sacred cow required a team of 30 laborers to maneuver into place. For 10 days of this intense effort, the workers might receive a full month's wages, testimony to the importance and grandeur of the cult. Beyond the burial chambers dedicated to the sacred bulls and their mothers, an extensive network of underground passageways housed the remains of mummified baboons. These animals, primarily transported by river or sea from regions south of the Sahara, since only a small number could be bred in captivity, were kept within a designated enclosure at the Temple of Ptah in Memphis. There, they were venerated as earthly manifestations of Thoth, the god of wisdom, and as symbols of the hearing ear, believed to mediate between mortals and the divine. In this way, animals served as the saints of ancient Egyptian religion. After death, each baboon was sanctified as an incarnation of Osiris and interred in a rectangular wooden coffin, which was placed into a niche carved into the rock walls of the catacombs. These niches were sealed with limestone slabs inscribed with the baboon's name, its place of origin, and a devotional message. One such inscription read, "May you be praised before Osiris. O you Osiris, Mars the baboon. He was brought from the south. His salvation took place, and he was placed in his coffin in the Temple of Ptah." Pilgrims traveled to Saqqara from across the country, hoping to receive guidance, healing, insight into future events, or even favorable outcomes in legal disputes. They offered gifts or paid for the burial of a sacred animal, believing that Osiris the baboon would deliver their pleas to the gods. The site bustled with dream interpreters, astrologers, seers, charm vendors, and magicians offering their services to the many faithful. Meanwhile, the priests and embalmers profited handsomely from this spiritual economy. They often used less costly, smaller monkeys in place of the rarer baboons, taking advantage of the fact that the wrapped mummies made it difficult for buyers to detect the substitution. Among the most expansive of Saqqara's animal necropolises were the ibis catacombs. Like baboons, Ibises were sacred to Thoth, and in the Egyptian pursuit of divine knowledge, they mummified and interred as many as 2 million of these birds at Saqqara alone. Each gallery, roughly 30 feet high and 30 feet wide, was packed from floor to ceiling with pottery jars, each containing either a full ibis mummy or selected body parts. To meet this extraordinary demand, ibises were raised on a large scale at Lake Abu-Sur and other locations throughout Egypt. In Kmun, the primary center for Thoth's worship, massive areas were dedicated to feeding and tending the birds. Upon death, even the smallest remnants, feathers, nesting materials, eggshell fragments, were meticulously collected for ritual use. Priests would sometimes bury the carcasses temporarily to speed up decomposition, allowing easier separation of bones for individual burial items and, consequently, higher profits. Turpentine imported from Tyre was used to accelerate this process, though it often charred the bones within the wrappings. Still, by the time the damage was discovered, the pilgrim had long since departed. The final animal burial complex at Saqqara was reserved for falcons, sacred to the god Horus. Here, Egyptian creativity took yet another step forward. In addition to offering mummified falcons, devotees could purchase and donate bronze or stone statues of Horus. Each statue had a hollow base with a sliding panel, into which either a small offering, such as a bit of mummified shrew as food for the falcon god, or a written prayer on a papyrus scroll could be inserted. By combining petition and offering in one package, the worshipper hoped to ensure both were received together, increasing the likelihood of divine favor. As a solar deity, Horus naturally complemented Thoth, who was associated with the moon. This made ibises and falcons an ideal symbolic pairing. However, there was a more strategic reason behind the widespread appeal of the falcon cult at Saqqara. It was actively promoted and supported by the state. The government had little genuine interest in popular religious practices, but it was highly invested in reinforcing the ideology of kingship. According to ancient Egyptian belief, the king was the living embodiment of Horus. Furthermore, Nakhthar-Heb's very name meant Horus of Hebet is victorious, drawing an even tighter connection between the monarch and the falcon god. As a result, the cult of Nakhthar-Heb the falcon was cultivated alongside that of the sacred animal, to the point where the two became virtually indistinguishable. This was a deliberate effort to channel public devotion into support for the monarchy. From the outset of his reign, Nakhthar-Heb understood the power of religious symbolism and historical legacy in reinforcing his authority. One of his earliest commands to his loyal official Wennefer was to revive the ancient mortuary cults of Snefru and Jetefra, pharaohs who had ruled during the pinnacle of the Pyramid Age. This move carried significant propaganda value, as it linked Egypt's current ruler with two legendary kings of its distant past. Outside of Memphis, Nakhthar-Heb launched an unprecedented wave of construction, rivaling even the building efforts of Ramesses II. Nearly every temple in Egypt saw some form of royal restoration or embellishment. Nakhthar-Heb was determined to be remembered not just as a military leader or opportunist, but as a legitimate pharaoh in the full sense of the title. Yet beneath this architectural enthusiasm lay a hint of anxiety. Much of his focus was on reinforcing gateways and perimeter walls, the areas most vulnerable to attack. It appeared that he was deeply committed to defending Egypt's sacred spaces from external threats. In this way, his religious activities mirrored his foreign policy, both aimed at shielding Egypt from its enemies. Meanwhile, the Persian Empire had never truly accepted the loss of Egypt, its wealthiest province. No number of temples, sacred burials, or royal rituals could distract them from their determination to reclaim the Nile Valley. In 373 BCE, Nakhtembef had successfully thwarted a Persian attempt to invade the delta. But 30 years later, his grandson Nakhthar-Heb was not so fortunate. The army of King Artaxerxes III captured the key coastal city of Pelusium with relative ease and continued its advance southward to Memphis. By late summer of 343 BCE, the capital had fallen, Egyptian resistance had collapsed, and independence was lost. Nakhthar-Heb, the last native-born Egyptian to rule the country without foreign challenge until modern times, fled into exile. Ultimately, his devout religiosity and political maneuvering were no match for the overwhelming power of the Persian military. Egypt's brief period of autonomy came to an end, and the country was once again absorbed as a satrapy within the vast Persian Empire, as if the last 70 years had never happened. Anyone alive during the Persian invasion of 343 who still remembered Cambyses' conquest nearly 2 centuries earlier would have been struck by a profound sense of history repeating itself. Yet for the majority of Egyptians who had grown used to a fragile sense of independence, this sudden reabsorption into foreign rule must have felt like a devastating blow. Across the country, particularly in the provinces, many chose to turn a blind eye to the latest upheaval. Instead, they quietly carried on with their lives, clinging to their native customs and traditions as a quiet form of resistance against their new foreign overlords. One poignant example of this quiet defiance was Padiasir, a devout follower of Thoth living in Kaman, the god's main sanctuary. Amid the noisy cries of sacred ibises being fed nearby, Padiasir went about his temple duties with unwavering dedication, even as the country around him descended into chaos. He later reflected on this turbulent time. "I served for 7 years as the overseer for this god, managing his estate faultlessly, while a foreign ruler held power in Egypt. Nothing remained in its proper place. Conflict had erupted throughout the land. The south was in disorder, the north in revolt. Temples stood empty of their priests, who had fled in confusion, unsure of what was unfolding. Egypt's deep-rooted faith in its traditions had long been its greatest asset. But in a world that was shifting rapidly, that very faith became a liability. What once upheld Egyptian civilization during the stable centuries of the 3rd and 2nd millennia could no longer shield it from the unpredictable pressures of emerging global powers. The country had lost its central role in world affairs and had become just one more rich prize in the struggles between younger, more dynamic empires. Padiasir's quiet devotion, while admirable, was also symbolic of a broader national paralysis. Faced with unfamiliar challenges, most Egyptians preferred to look away, put their trust in the old gods, and maintain their rituals in the hope that life would somehow return to normal. The final flicker of Egypt's long-standing spirit of independence came late in 338 BCE. The catalyst was the death of yet another Persian ruler. While the court in Persepolis mourned the passing of Artaxerxes III and made preparations for his successor, a final, defiant Egyptian figure emerged to free the land. Very little is definitively known about Qababash, a man whose obscurity mirrored the desperate odds he faced. Possibly a native of Memphis, or at least closely connected to the city, Qababash quickly gained recognition there as a legitimate king. His call for liberation resonated far beyond the Delta. Even Thebes lent its support, signaling a rare moment of unity across the country. From Upper Egypt to the Mediterranean coast, a collective desire for freedom from Persian rule surged. Qababash was the nation's last hope. Understanding that any Persian retaliation would likely come via the sea, he moved swiftly to the key port of Perwajet. There, he navigated the marshlands and inspected every channel that led to the Great Green, the Mediterranean Sea, preparing to fend off the incoming fleet from Asia. Strategically, it was a sound plan. But even with the hopes of a nation resting on his shoulders, Qababash was no match for the Persian war machine at its most formidable. His revolt endured for less than 2 years. His ultimate fate remains unknown. In the end, Persia re-established control under a new ruler, Darius III, who reigned over Egypt from 336 to 332 BCE and over Persia until 331 BCE. Egypt's dream of independence, once again, came to a close. Egypt had never held greater importance for the Persian Empire. Its abundant resources were crucial for funding mercenary armies, which the empire now relied upon more than ever in its struggles. For 150 years, Persia had been locked in a prolonged conflict with the Greek world over dominance in the Aegean and Anatolia. Both Sparta and Athens had proven to be relentless adversaries, standing firm against Persian power and dealing humiliating blows through acts of courage and resistance. Now the focus had shifted northward toward the rugged kingdom of Macedon. This rising power had recently assumed the mantle of pan-Hellenic leadership in opposition to Persian dominance. In the late summer of 336 BCE, just as Darius III was ascending the throne in Persepolis, the young Macedonian king Alexander III was gaining recognition throughout Greece as leader of the League of Corinth and as commander of the Persian campaign originally conceived by his father. The world stood at a decisive crossroads, though Darius could not have foreseen it. By the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander had crossed the Hellespont into the Persian-controlled west and begun his march southward to confront the empire's forces. The decisive encounter at the Granicos River in May marked the start of Persia's unraveling. Through the summer, Alexander continued his campaign through Anatolia, culminating in the siege of Halicarnassus. As autumn and winter unfolded, his army advanced along the coastline, meeting little resistance. Then, in November 333 BCE, a second major clash occurred at Issos in Cilicia. Ironically, many Egyptian troops served among the Persian ranks during these campaigns. Most were likely ordinary soldiers, loyal to whoever offered payment. But some members of Egypt's elite also lent their support. Among them, the eldest son of the exiled king Nakhtarheb, who appeared to see no conflict in aligning with the very power that had dethroned his father. Time and again, Egypt's military, regardless of rank, had shown a clear preference to back the side most likely to prevail. With their long and storied history, the Egyptians understood all too well that it was the victors who shaped the narrative. But Persia's days were numbered. One notable collaborator, Semetotefnacht, witnessed yet another devastating defeat for Darius. Realizing that Alexander's momentum seemed unstoppable, he was struck by a sudden urge to return home, whether from homesickness or a desire for self-preservation. He deserted the battlefield and made his way back to Egypt, ready to embrace a new regime and seize fresh opportunities under its rule. As tales of Alexander's military brilliance and unrelenting ambition reached the Nile Valley, many Egyptians began to wonder whether he might be the liberator they needed to end Persian domination. Lacking a native-born hero to rally behind, and with only two clear options, Darius or Alexander, the Macedonian began to seem the lesser evil. His reputation for brutality was already well known. After a brutal 7-month siege of Tyre in 332 BCE, Alexander punished the surviving defenders by having them publicly crucified. A few months later, Gaza's governor, who had dared to shut the city's gates against him, suffered an even grimmer fate. He was tied alive to a chariot and dragged around the city's perimeter until death finally claimed him. No one and nothing was permitted to stand in Alexander's path. Yet for the Egyptians, accustomed as they were to autocratic rulers, such displays of despotism were far from unfamiliar. For nearly 3 millennia, authoritarianism had been a central feature of life in the Nile Valley. As Egyptians looked wistfully to their once glorious past, many likely saw in Alexander the embodiment of a traditional pharaoh, unyielding, feared, and commanding respect. More crucially, he was a conqueror, a proven victor. And after years of subjugation and defeat, Egypt yearned for triumph, even if it came through someone else. In the final weeks of 332 BCE, Alexander crossed into Egypt and took control without encountering any resistance. The Persian forces simply vanished. Now, the conqueror of much of the known world stood on Egyptian soil. Whether by instinct or through shrewd counsel, he understood what was expected of him in this ancient land. One of his first gestures upon arriving in Memphis was to honor the sacred Apis bull. The revered animal was led out from its enclosure into a courtyard, where the curious Macedonian could observe it. To the Egyptians, this act signaled a revival of tradition. Here was a new ruler who respected their ancient rites. However, Alexander's interest in Egyptian religion went deeper than political theater. Like so many foreign conquerors before him, he was captivated by the richness and antiquity of Egyptian culture. Egypt had begun to exert its unique, almost magical charm upon him. Until then, nothing had slowed Alexander's relentless campaign. Each victory propelled him forward, denying his enemies any opportunity to regroup. Yet now, in a surprising break from his military momentum, he chose to turn away from the pursuit of Darius. In early 331 BCE, after founding a new city, Alexandria, that would forever bear his name, Alexander did not head east to confront the Persian king. Instead, he journeyed westward into the vast sands of the Sahara. His destination lay some 300 miles away, the Siwa oasis and its renowned oracle of Ammonius. What transpired between Alexander and the deity remains a mystery, but it marked a turning point. He emerged from the desert transformed, not merely a king, but a divine figure, proclaimed as son of the Creator God himself. According to his own telling, he had received the answer his soul had longed to hear. And so, the Macedonian warlord became Pharaoh of Egypt. It would be more than 2,000 years before a native-born Egyptian once again ruled the Nile Valley. Yet the legacy and power of Egypt's ancient civilization remained as potent and alluring as ever. In the end, Padiasir and others like him had been vindicated.